Welcome. My name is Rebecca Slayton. I'm the director of the Repi Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies and I'm a professor in the Science and Technology Studies Department here at Cornell. I want to start with a brief land acknowledgement. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayakono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayakono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for today. James Patton Rogers, Dr. James Patton Rogers, is the Executive Director of the Cornell Brooks Tech Policy Institute at Cornell University and the NATO Country Director of the Full Spectrum Drone Warfare Project, supported by the NATO Science for Peace and Security Program. He's an expert on drones, disruptive technologies, and the history of weaponry and strategy. He's worked with the United Nations Security Council, the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, and other organizations within the UN. He's also the author of Precision, A History of American Warfare, which came out just last year. So we're excited to hear more about it.
There's so much to talk about with drones, and I think increasingly so as the days go by. And so an academic talk perhaps doesn't pay justice to some of the latest trends and developments that we're seeing in modern warfare. And some of the troubling uses of this technology we're seeing by both state and violent non-state actor groups. So if you have something pressing on your mind, you want to raise a question about it, you want to derail my talk and lead us in another direction, I'm happy for that to happen because I think it's important that we keep engaged with the latest debates. And that's kind of what I tried to do with this talk today, called Killing Precisely, the Global Proliferation of Drones and Precision Warfare. In particular, I'm going to focus on something that we've been developing for the last few years called the second drone age, which seeks to try and help us understand the global proliferation of drones to violent non-state actor groups and to hostile states. This was the topic that you were given as part of your reading, and so I thought, as a means to try and encourage a bit more discussion, we'd try and keep in line with that. This is the area we're going to be most informed in. But to understand the second drone age, this age that I argue that we're in today, I guess we have to go back to the first drone, especially in the American experience, and the first drone age itself, which are separated, again, in the American experience by about 100 years. And as Professor Slayton mentioned, I've got a book that came out in December called Precision, A History of American Warfare, where I go into arguably far too much detail about the development of drones and precision weapon systems over that 100-year period. You'll be relieved that I will not be going to that level of detail about that history today. We're going to keep on the contemporary issues, looking at how drones have developed from around 2015 through to 2024 and some of the threats that have occurred. But like I say, we need to understand where all of this comes from in the American experience, at least. Now, drones were first deployed as part of the First World War. And the reason why drones were developed was because the United States had undergone a period of conflict that it certainly hadn't been used to for a number of generations. We had the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, the 1904 Roosevelt Corollary, both of which had stated that the US would stay out the brutal wars of the European Old World. Instead, the US was more focused on small policing wars and bandit interventions. So you've got, I guess, Cuba, 1906, Nicaragua, 1911, Haiti, 1915. The idea that the United States would reinforce and make sure it had control over its broader geographical bounds. And these, like I say, were smaller policing wars and bandit interventions. It wasn't about mass deployments and expeditionary warfare in Europe. In fact, the last time the US had been involved in its a major entrenched, what you could call, I guess, the first modern war, would be going back to the US Civil War. And we moved through that period of the 1910s with promises that the US would not get involved in those conflicts in Europe. Wilson is elected on the idea that he wouldn't draw America into that conflict. But of course, America does get drawn in. And you have this argument that the US loses a generation, the lost generation of its youngest, its best, and its brightest. You have around 300,000 American casualties from the battlefields of Europe. And there are protests in the street, the argument being that the US should never get involved in these type of wars again. It was the whole argument before they went into these type of wars. And this was particularly popular with the public. Like I say, there were quite a lot of protests and marches, but it became increasingly popular with politicians. And as a means to try and figure out ways in which the United States could fight the wars of the future, but without deploying troops en masse in these bloody, muddy battlefields of Europe. You had a couple of early American fledgling air power thinkers that were part of the US Army Air Service. And we have to remember that, this is around 15 years since the first flight, the Wright Flyer, and you've already got these deployed into warfare itself. But people like Colonel Edgar S. Gorell, who was the first historian of the US Army Air Service post-First World War, and Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, who would become one of the early pioneers of American air power, they started to think about ways in which you could deploy air power in the future that would allow the United States to go over and not through the enemy, to bomb enemy industry, war-making capacity with pinpoint precision, so that you could blunt their capacity to produce bombs and bullets. You could destroy their oil refineries. You could make sure that when you actually finally met your enemy on the battlefield, they wouldn't have the capacity, the teeth to fight you back. So you wouldn't have that entrenched attritional warfare. Instead, when your military is finding that, you would be able to push on through. This was the theory at least. It became something called industrial web theory, which then more colloquially became known as precision bombing doctrine. And one of the weapon systems that they tried to manufacture to make this a reality was the Kettering bug, one of the first drone systems that the United States sought to develop. Now, you could call this, they call it an aerial torpedo, you could call it an early cruise missile, you could say it's an early drone technology. It certainly looks like some of the systems that we still see deployed in warfare today. And of course, a lot of drones are still set off rails and sent towards the target. And that's exactly what this was. Set off rails, it had an early Sperry gyroscope to keep it stable in the air. To set its range, you would preset its piston motor, its propeller on the front. You would turn it a certain amount of revolutions that then dictated how far it would be able to fly. And then once it hit that limit, which at this point was around 100 kilometers, but they hoped it would go up to 1,000 kilometers, the motor would stop, a shock would be released in the wings, and then the wings would drop off and it would swoop down on its prey like a falcon. At least that's what they argued. Now, in reality, it was worse than useless. It would swoop around in the sky and come back and actually try and target its own forces. But for our story, that doesn't really matter, because deep at the heart of the ambition of all of this was to try and use machines in a frontline role to mitigate the cost and risk to military personnel. And at the heart of that, I guess, is the essence of what the drone was originally all about. And here is where we can leapfrog a century over towards the Obama administration, because Obama faced, I guess, a somewhat similar predicament when he came to power. He'd been elected on the promise that he would withdraw America from the illegal war in Iraq, and he would win the good war in Afghanistan. And he would do all of that whilst you had other terrorist groups popping up all around the world as part of the global war on terror, trying to defeat those groups, but without increasing the areas in which US troops were being deployed. And so for him, he saw the drone, which by this point had matured into Predator and Reaper systems, these medium altitude, long endurance drones that could be controlled from thousands of kilometers away without a pilot on board and send pinpoint precise Hellfire missiles down onto their targets. He saw these as being a way in which he could deliver on all those promises to the American people. And he argued, I quote from the president here in 2013, that drones are part of a just war, a war waged proportionately. He would go on to say that drones are precise and, simply put, they save lives. And when you look further into Obama's speeches, he's talking about, of course, saving American military lives, but there was a belief that this increase in precision would also mean that you did take out the bad guys and you saved the good. You took out the high-profile military targets and you avoided the civilians. Now, I'm sure I don't need to mention to anyone in the room that there are lots of debates and controversies around the American drone program. And the argument that when Obama said he killed a high-profile target, the chances were that they'd killed the wrong person 4 times with those pinpoint precision strikes before they actually took out the high-profile targets. And then you had things like signature strikes, which were less about using intelligence of specific people, but using a broader characteristic of terrorist identifiers, terrorist signatures, that allowed you to have more of a broad brush application of your precision strikes and take out people suspected of being terrorists, which, as you can imagine, led to thousands of civilian casualties. And so there were lots of controversies around this period, especially in the human rights community, but there were also a lot of people who lauded the Obama administration's use of drones, most specifically, of course, the following Trump administration, and there's still a cornerstone of the Biden administration's deployment of military systems abroad. But we started to see that a lot of other nation states and also violent non-state actor groups saw this somewhat ubiquitous ability to deploy bolts of lightning from the sky to kill one's enemy as being something quite alluring, quite desirable. And it's here that we move through to the second drone age. Now, when I was working with the UN Security Council and during my address to the UN Security Council in 2022, I argued that drones, once deemed to be this panacea for the protection of nations, are now amongst the greatest threats to state security. That incredibly powerful long-range precision strike capability, that ability to ensure guaranteed pinpoint precise destruction on your enemy, has now returned back to the United States and its allies. And despite all of the warnings from, at the very least, the late 1980s, very little had been done to prepare us for this new drone age. So that's a big claim to make. Let me try and back it up with some of the stats that me and my team have been working on over the last few years. So in 2010, 60 nations had a drone program. That's not to say that 60 nations had the ability to deploy weaponized armed drone systems. It's more to say that they were developing drones and really interested in doing so. And that makes sense. We're looking at this point here where we start to get more towards the height of the Obama administration's drone program. Bearing in mind the Obama administration used drones into their thousands, whereas previously before that the Bush administration had used drones, or at least they admit they used drones, only around 52, 54 times. So they really did become this key point of the Obama administration's deployment of force. Now today, an estimated 118 countries have military drones, and by this we mean that they have them in their military arsenals. So here we're looking at, I think, a 96.2% increase in around 15 years. So quite the proliferation of these systems, and that's just state actors. We can also see that at least 65 armed groups around the globe are now capable of deploying armed drones, likely much more. We don't know exactly how many because terrorist groups don't usually declare exactly what is in their arsenals until you're on the delivery end of them. And we're seeing that as truly being a global phenomena, with drones being deployed by criminal gangs and terrorist groups on pretty much every major occupied continent. And we'll go into some of those examples about that today. How are they used? Well, they're used for assassination, short, medium, and long-range precision strikes, kamikaze strikes, these saturation attacks that are sometimes called swarm attacks. We don't currently have true swarms, and we can talk about that in the questions of what a true swarm is, but we certainly have drones sent in their multiples at a target to try and overwhelm enemy air defenses, which is becoming a very dangerous and hard to defend against phenomena. And then, of course, intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, and reconnaissance as well. But all this time, I've been talking about drones as if they're one particular type of technology. And actually, they're a very diverse ecosystem of systems. And depending on what type of drone is being deployed, well, it depends on the type of threats that we need to defend against. And so I'm going to split this into commercial quadcopter systems and the way that they've been used by violent non-state actor groups most recently, and then also fixed wing systems and how they've been supplied by hostile states to violent non-state actor groups. And it's here, I guess, that we can start to pass around a couple of these things. It won't bite. It's not turned on. I haven't secretly given Rebecca the controls. But this is pretty much a workhorse of what ISIS were using during their campaigns, and what the Ukrainian military have been using during their use and adoption of commercial quadcopter systems. This is part of the Mavic family of drones, so important to the Ukrainian military that China stopped selling them to them, and so Ukraine bought up 60% of the world's supply. And of course, this year, Zelensky says that Ukraine is on point to producing 4 million of its smaller tactical quadcopter systems. This here is the back end of a Shahed drone. Now, these are developed by the Iranians, and they are used by the Houthis out of Yemen, and they're also used by other proxy groups across the Middle East, used by the Iranians themselves, and of course, as we know, they've been supplied in their hundreds to the Russians as well. Please don't take it out of its wrapping. This has come straight out of an investigation file with permission, I promise. I haven't stolen it from one of our UN investigations, but it kind of shows you that we might think that the military grade systems and the larger systems are super high tech, but actually they're really basic, really cheap, and really easy to use. Whereas the quadcopter systems have perhaps got a bit more of a technological edge about them. And perhaps that's due to the domains that they work in, being a far more complex tactical domain as opposed to the reaches of a strategic long-range precision strike. So let's start with some of these commercial quadcopter systems. We'll start.
Ask real quick.
Oh, yeah.
What attaches to that to make it so dangerous? Like what weapon?
What would you like to attach to it to make it so dangerous?
I mean, are there just different packages that China sells to, or like how do they use it?
That's a good question. So no, these are drones used for commercial purposes. They're used for filming movies, for estate agents to survey houses and put them online so you get better sales. China would never create weaponized systems that would be used in war in that way. No. And so what we're seeing instead is an awful lot of 3D printer packages that allow you to 3D print attachments that then allow you to put grenades or mortar shells onto them. That's something that ISIS used quite a lot, right? And they would adapt and amend their mortar shells so they weighed less, and you could put maybe between 4 and 6 off of them. And then you have a remote release device that means that when you're above your enemy, let's say 200 to 500 feet in the air, you can then drop those and have your own rudimentary precision strike system, right? What we're seeing now is it's just become far more everyday, industrialized as part of Russia's offensive war against Ukraine, as part of Ukrainian use of these systems. They have complete production lines that allow you to have these attachments that you put onto the drones, and then they produce specific munitions that you can use off them as well that increase the amount of drones that the amount of bomblets that you can have deploying off them. Of course you can. Yeah, absolutely. So what we also note about these systems, and of course, these drones are now routinely cannibalized for their parts, because Russia has figured out how to block commercial drone systems, right? So you can utilize these parts. They're quite modular by design, so you can swap them in and out. You can put new command and control systems in place, more powerful motors to give them a better range. You can try and put better electronic warfare measures on them. But there's an entire kind of artisanal production capacity in Ukraine that has led to this production of the 4 million of those systems. And that includes the payload packets as well on them. So something that started with ISIS as being super rudimentary has now become really quite run of the mill. Yeah.
How close do you have to be to that to control it? I mean, it's not something, what is the controller?
Well, it depends on your enemy's spoofing capability. So if they can spoof the signal of that drone, so that's sending a stronger signal up to the drone system to take control of it, then you need to be closer and closer to your drone system in order to maintain control over it. So what started off in Ukraine was being about 8 to 5 kilometers back from the front line, and you could maintain control over one of those systems. You know, that's really the maximum range you're going to have off them, especially if they've got the kind of more basic battery package. You maybe got a 30-minute, 40-minute flight time. That's increasing, but what is decreasing is that range, and that's because you have a more contested battlefield and people getting wiser of how to counter these systems. And so you need to be closer and closer. So now we're looking at drone operators being in the trenches alongside the frontline troops. Now we're looking at, if you're lucky, you're maybe 1 kilometer away from the front line. So what was once seen as deploying death from a distance and keeping your drone operators safe is now just another potent element of incredibly brutal attritional warfare, which is interesting to note because of all the promises of the Obama campaign of how drones will revolutionize war and we have a just war. Drones have been less about reducing the cost to civilian lives as well, and we will talk about that as we go through. And we've just seen that these are now being used by Russia to target civilians in cities towards the front line. Yeah, it's getting just closer and closer and tighter to the point now where actually we're seeing that the Ukrainians are having to attach very lightweight fiber optic cables to their drones. So they have a tethered system that means that it's somewhat undetectable by the Russian air defense systems. And it means you can't spoof that signal and you can't intercept it. And that means that they've now got an extended range of, I think, 12 kilometers. And they call these, someone can correct me, I think it's the Baba Yada.
It's like a 12-kilometer fiber optic?
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Which takes us back to how the first kind of drones were used. The balloons were detonated over Vienna in 1849, I think it was, with a copper cable spieled back, detonating them. So in some ways, these drones are super high tech. In others, they're not very high tech.
My question about these commercial quadcopters is about training for like ISIS and non-state actors. Are they being trained by, I don't know, various countries and organizations, or is it more like how, let's say one of us bought a drone, we would just test it out until we know how to use it?
Well, I will say that I have my drone license, which means that literally anybody can fly these things, right? I'm a historian, and if I can fly it, then anybody can fly it, right? I won't answer your question about ISIS because we're going to get to a slide on that, so you're preempting me nicely. But I will say we're seeing one disturbing trend that I learned during a UN Office of Counterterrorism conference we had a couple of weeks ago based in Senegal, which was how we're seeing those who are trained by using these drone systems, especially the quadcopters and now increasingly the first-person view drone systems in Ukraine or by Russia against Ukraine, they're now selling their services around the world to criminal gangs and other violent non-state actor groups to teach them in the tactics and the strategies of this drone use. Another, I guess, quite disturbing trend in this is that we're seeing that as countries in the Sahel are becoming overrun, and they have their own drone stocks and drone arsenals, they're capturing, the violent non-state actor groups are capturing the drone stocks, holding the military personnel prisoner who have been trained how to use these, and then forcing them to train them at gunpoint of how to use them. So there's some really quite novel and disturbing drivers of the proliferation of tactics, use, strategies, and technologies happening at this moment in time. But again, none of this should be particularly surprising. We can go back to Shirikyo in the 1990s, who were one of the first, if not the first, terrorist organization to try and experiment with drone technologies. Shirikyo, anyone familiar? Yeah? Maybe a couple, yeah? Want to give me some details of who they were?
Well, they're most famous for the sarin attack.
Yeah, absolutely. And they got to that point only after they'd failed time and time again to produce more high-tech systems, right? So they were led by a charismatic leader, Ansari, who saw himself as a kind of Jesus, Allah figure who wanted to bring about an apocalypse, an Armageddon, an end to the world, because by doing that, he could rebuild the world in his image and his vision. And so he set about recruiting incredibly smart people that could help him build sophisticated weapons technologies that could only be deployed by a nation state. Because if he was able to deploy them, then it might fool the great powers into thinking they were being attacked by another great power and trigger that great power war, especially during those early days of the 1990s. So he set up yoga studios, made a shed load of money from that, targeted specifically PhD students in STEM topics, and radicalized them and brought them into the fold. Using that money that he made from the yoga studios, he tried to buy attack helicopters from Russia, did buy an attack helicopter from Russia, actually. He tried to buy nuclear weapon systems, no one was going to sell in that. They brought a sheep farm in Australia where we believe that they were trying to mine uranium. And some of the recent academic papers have shown that some of the earthquakes that happened around that area of the sheep farm in Australia might now have been some primitive tests of dirty bombs happening in that area. But what they went with in the end was they went with sarin, which they were able to pretty easily make. And what they wanted to do was set ventilators onto the drone filled with a sarin liquid and then disperse that over cities. Now, because they were making their own drones and they didn't have the reliable command and control to be able to control them reliably, they quickly moved away from that as being an option. They also tried to put ventilator fans in the back of a van, drive around the districts where prominent politicians lived in Tokyo, and to spray it out of the truck. But they put the system into the wrong setting and sprayed it back in at themselves. So in the end, they went with a super low-tech system. They filled bags full of sarin liquid, went onto the Tokyo subway with sharpened umbrellas, stabbed those bags, in and out as quickly as they could, and they killed 13 and injured 5,000 in that attack. But again, the fact that the drone use didn't work isn't important for our story here. It's more the fact that terrorist organizations, even very early on, were seeing that there might be some utility of these systems. And we can jump 2015, but we have to stay in Japan for one of the first successful uses of a terrorist drone deployment. Here, we'd seen that from the terrible incidences of 2011 and the problems we had at the Fukushima nuclear power plant and the rupturing of that plant there after the earthquake that happened. By 2015, the Japanese government were looking to try and reopen those nuclear power plants. And a lot of environmentalist groups were not particularly happy about that. One in particular, a self-proclaimed environmental terrorist called Mr. Yamamoto, he went and bought a drone off the internet. And this was 2015 when we were all starting to get drones for the holidays, right, where I'm wrapping them. Well, he decided to make the most of being able to buy drones online, purchased one, took it home, painted it black so that you couldn't see the flashing lights at night, then went down to the Fukushima prefecture and got as much contaminated radioactive waste as he could, took it back to his apartment, filled containers full of it, attached it to the drone, went down to Tokyo to the Japanese Prime Minister's residence, to the car park there in the dead of night, and then flew that drone onto the Japanese Prime Minister's residence, landed it on the roof where it sat radiating for 2 weeks without anybody noticing. Now, Mr. Yamamoto himself was incredibly annoyed by this. If you're a self-proclaimed terrorist, you kind of want to get your message out there. And the fact that no one was talking about it was frustrating to him. So he went onto his blog, he went onto different sites and started saying about what he had done, he was going to do it again, and he readied a second drone. Now, by this point, 2 weeks later, Japanese security services had found the drone on the roof after they'd done a routine security scan for a helicopter that was due to land up there. They monitored the chatter, as any good security service does, and they found him pretty promptly. But this story really captured my interest and was really quite worrying, and caused a number of us who are working on drones used by nation states to turn our attention to drones used by violent non-state actors, and I guess, I suppose, to get us to look up, so to speak, pun intended. And it's from this point onwards that we start to see drones being used more frequently. And so we saw them being used by ISIS from 2015, 2016 onwards, and we'll come to that as a case study in a second. And since that point onwards, we've seen them used in attempted assassinations of commercial quadcopter systems. Packed explosives were used to try and kill President Maduro in Venezuela in 2018. Parts of commercial systems were used to try and attack the Iraqi prime minister. Of course, we saw that commercial drones were used by Hamas in the October 7th attacks, used them to really render those remote observation and communication stations useless by bombing them, taking out some of the cameras, taking out some of the antenna and the transmission capabilities, and then moving them over the fence, over the border, to target the tanks and the first responders. So they're a key part of making that attack as deadly and as awful as it was. And since then, we're just seeing extended range, better command and control, and also no longer drones being used in their ones and twos, but being used en masse as much as possible. Another couple of examples that I just want to finish off here before we move on to the ISIS case, and tell me when I need to hurry up or need to
Yeah, you're
stop.
good, you're good.
Okay. We've seen that Criminal gangs in Colombia, across South and Central America, have been using drones to target law enforcement officials, judges, and high-ranking members of the police, but also other criminal gangs as well. That's something that is only continuing to be a staple of those groups. We've actually seen some of those operatives I mentioned, Max, going over to Central and South America to train them better in how to use them. But one of the ones that fascinates me is one that we've forgotten, which is how these drones were used by criminal gangs in China. So this occurred in the January of 2020. So there's a reason we've forgotten about this one, because all of us had our attentions diverted from around the February, March of 2020. But it ties to COVID in an interesting and disturbing way, at least a way we found pretty disturbing at the time, because African swine flu was spreading across China at that point at a record pace. And so we're talking about January 2020. We're talking about a time when we're seeing Chinese New Year. We're seeing at a time where pork stocks are the most expensive, the most valuable that they can be. Now, Chinese criminal gangs had a monopoly over frozen pork meat. Now, please excuse me, I'm going to talk about pork meat more than I ever thought I would for the next 2 minutes. And I promise you, it's interesting. Now, Chinese criminal gangs had this monopoly over frozen pork meat. So the more that African swine flu spread, the more their prices went up. And so what they decided to do was they got hold of drones with around an 8-kilometer range. They packed them full of infected pork meat, flew them into Chinese swine farms, pig farms that have thousands upon thousands of stock, and then allowed the pigs to eat that meat that then saw the spread of the infection at a rapid rate. Now, what that meant, like I said, was the price of the frozen meat went up, but canny criminals, they went and bought the infected pork meat off the farmers and then shipped it to the south of China so they can make double their money selling it as uninfected pork meat. Why is this a worry as we start to see COVID spreading? Well, we think, well, drones could be used to start spreading a virus, could start spreading a biological agent. But perhaps one of the more interesting things about this is that the Chinese state didn't react quickly enough to this problem, and so the farmers did. And they clubbed together and they bought industrial scale counter-drone systems, frequency jammers, that meant that they would have these radiating above their farms. And they started to affect civil aviation. And so you started to have commercial passenger jets that were being affected by these counter-drone systems. And it's from that point that the Chinese government did get involved, actually brought charges against the farmers themselves and put a stop to this practice. But again, all of it is very interesting as pertinent reminders of how these high-tech yet simple to use toys come potential weapons have violated even the most secure government, urban and civil sites. And here's where we come to the ISIS drones. And I focus in on the case of Basil Hassan because, I mean, I was working on drones from around, well, working on drones for a lot longer when it comes to state use, but the violent non-state actor use from around 2015. And we started to see this case emerging in Denmark from around 2018 of what we call the Copenhagen cell. And it was spearheaded by this Danish national called Basil Hassan, who had an engineering degree and a passion for aerospace, who had been tapping into this readily available commercial arsenal of systems, especially thermal imaging cameras, more powerful motors, things that really made the drones, the commercial drone systems, stand out and enhanced for more military use. And he was shipping them, as many as he could, as possible, over to Turkey to be smuggled over the border into Syria, and actually then moved across to the captured Mosul University, where they had their drone lab and they had their chemical and biological weapons lab that they were testing at the time as well. Now, I moved out to Denmark in 2018 to help do a bit of the investigation into this and to write some reports on it. So for me, it was a very interesting time to be working on how ISIS were using these systems. And it was thanks to people like Basil Hassan that ISIS went from a terrorist group, like most terrorist groups in the past that have no potent air power capability, to be one of the first terrorist organizations who are able to deploy air power tactically en masse against coalition forces during Operation Inherent Resolve. Now, Hassan himself fled Denmark, fled to Turkey, tried to move over to the border, but was captured by Turkish authorities. That's not the end of his story, though, because he was there for 2 weeks and then swapped in a prisoner swap with ISIS, where he then went on to become a mastermind behind the drone program. So not ideal in terms of intelligence sharing there. But what we saw early on was we saw ISIS using drones for surveillance, to help guide their suicide bombers, to help guide their sniper fire, to help guide their vehicle-borne IEDs. But very quickly, they realized that coalition forces were shooting down the drones, taking them into their bases and inspecting them for any sort of metadata they can get off them, or any ways that they can find out to counter these systems. And so ISIS decided to turn these into booby traps, Trojan horse drones, as we called them at the time, pack them full of explosives, and then allow them to be shot down. After a short cat and mouse game, the drones would be lowered in terms of their altitude and they could be more easily shot out of the sky. At that point, the drones were then rudimentarily taken in and unpacked by coalition forces. And we saw that at that point we had the severe injury to French special forces, death to Kurdish special forces, and a lot of others that have not been publicly acknowledged. And then ISIS really saw the utility of these, and it's here we started getting the 3D printing as well. And so they started having these rudimentary release devices for grenades and mortars, then replacing metal parts of the mortar shells with plastic parts that could then fix to their 3D printed release devices and reduce the weight so they could drop more and more of them. And by the time that we come towards the end of this campaign, we see that within a 24-hour period, there were no less than 82 drones of all shapes and sizes lobbing bombs at Iraqi, Kurdish, US, and French special forces. And in all my interviews, the same thing would come up time and time again, especially from American force protection officers. We have lost air superiority at a tactical level. Legacies of this, of course, we can see that Russia also faced a similar threat in Syria at this time and started to experiment with their own quadcopter systems. And so we can really see this as being the genesis of what would become a staple of modern warfare. So yes, that's the quadcopter systems. Any questions? Yeah.
Can you elaborate more on the lost air superiority in a sense?
Yeah. So it was very difficult to counter these systems at the time, and it still is, right? Just because there aren't enough air defense systems deployed in order to protect every forward operating base or every forward detachment. We also saw that as troops moved towards, for example, Mosul, we saw that the drones were sent in at the front very quickly and at the back, causing a splintering effect that then allowed troops to be picked off by sniper fire and other drones that were sent in. And when I was talking to force protection officers, they were saying to me, look, we have two options here. My screen is lighting up like a Christmas tree. The drones are there, they're watching us. A lot of the time, I'm there and they're doing nothing. And so we either get lulled into a full sense of security where you just ignore the drones and you carry about your normal practices and you go to sleep, you do your normal rotations, everything else. And then, once in a blue moon, the drones will be then sent in to try and take an attack on those bases. Or you can stay awake at all times and be as vigilant as possible, which then affects operational effectiveness, right? And at this time, apart from when you had the movement of mobile air defense systems then brought into Mosul itself with air defense systems on the back to try and protect troops, you just didn't have that all-round kind of 360 coverage. And so it's at that point they were saying that we've lost this tactical air superiority because we just can't counter all the drones that are being sent at us. And I mean, is it different today? I mean, do we see that of course, we've had a lot more investment in counter-drone technologies and in air defense, and I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on it. But the drones are still getting through to the point where this year, of course, we've had the first death of US military personnel by a drone breaching Tower 22. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's been very interesting. I've always seen drones in warfare, especially recently with the Ukraine war, as a sort of equalizing tool. But it seems like it really more heavily benefits militias and sort of smaller groups over state actors. Is that because of the cost of deterrence being higher than the cost of production? Or is that because of sort of disparities in capabilities?
Yeah, it costs more to defend against them than it does to be offensive, right, with these systems, so that's a problem. I always find this question fascinating because every news report that you'll read on the war in Ukraine says how drones have revolutionized that war, right? And they've revolutionized war in general, and they're going to revolutionize all future wars. But where is that revolution? Because what revolutionary capacity have they given to a Russia or a Ukraine? We're in a brutal, bloody, attritional stalemate where drones are an added layer to already pre-existing systems. And if you look at the interviews with Zelensky and officials, they don't want more drones. They want high-tech long-range missile systems. They want artillery. They want
Band-Aid. The drones are a Band-Aid.
Exactly. But well, the drones are also what they can get, right? And so when it comes to modern mechanized warfare, or the modern system, as Biddle might call it, I don't see the revolution there. I do see the revolution when it comes to what we traditionally call asymmetric warfare and the use by violent non-state actor groups or smaller states that haven't been able to have a potent air power capability. And that's something we have to bear in mind when we have expeditionary wars and wars of choice in the future, where we think we can deploy in an Afghanistan or Iraq type way, when actually you have contested airspace. Yeah.
I think we are seeing a fundamental change in the idea of what surface warfare is because of this. Russia has lost 9,000, near 10,000 armored vehicles and tanks since 22. And primarily, we know that the Ukraine has nowhere near that number to be able to equalize that on the ground. It's been drone warfare that's really made the tank almost obsolete on the battlefield.
Yeah, it's really contested, right? Eric Schmidt came out today and said that the tank is over. Yeah.
And I think that's where we're seeing this fundamental shift right now. We're seeing that Russia is going through its old stockpiles of T-60s and T-72s to try and put things on the battlefield because they just can't keep up.
Yeah.
We're seeing a small number of the M1 Abrams being destroyed on the battlefield, 20 in the last year of the 35 that they've got. Russia's not being able to keep up with that, but we're seeing such a significant drop in their armor.
But I think we're seeing inflated numbers of kills of tanks being attributed to drone strikes, right? The tanks are being destroyed by the minefields, right? They're being destroyed by the improvised explosive devices, and then they're being finished off by the drones themselves. Or they're tanks that, are particularly old and perhaps more vulnerable to some of the drone systems we have out there. When it comes to Ukrainian side, the drones that are being destroyed that are in Ukrainian possession, including those supplied by the United States, they're being deployed by Russian high-tech Lancet drone systems, right? Which are more tantamount to more of a kind of tactical cruise missile system as opposed to a drone system.
Well, that's where the asynchronous warfare is more beneficial or is seeing more increase in value in this fight than if you were fighting another service that had uniforms the same as yours.
Yeah. There's no answer. We don't have an answer to this yet. I think it's one of the hottest debated things in the field about whether or not this is the death of tanks. We can debate it until the end of time here. But
we've seen the Marines moving away from being a heavy force to a light force in order to counter things with island hopping in the South China Sea. We're seeing the idea that it's more about mobility and small, very powerful abilities to project power is more important than being able to have these bigger elements, whether it be tanks or aircraft carriers.
Yeah.
Right? We're seeing these big changes to this.
We do have one question in the back that we want to keep going.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Even gonna tag on to his stuff just because
Yeah, no, please do, because the whole question around aircraft carriers as well. I mean, again, it's the big debate right now. Do you go with a future Navy that has smaller swarming drone systems, or do you go with the big ticket holy cows? But
The Red Sea Fleet was made to move because of drone rights, right? They had to pull them back.
Yeah. But also the most sophisticated air defense systems we have are on naval vessels that are providing a shield for Israel at the moment. So yeah, the Navy's designed to counter air attacks as well. So I don't know, again, I haven't come down on one side or the other yet. Yeah.
It definitely feels like with drones as they are like currently, you're hitting near the early like 40s and 50s with more precision bombing in the air power revolution, in which we're still early with the technologies, but do you think in around 10, 15 years that we might see the development of a new revolution in military affairs because of the fact that as the technologies progress and get more sophisticated, then again, if you have a giant aircraft carrier and you have a tiny little bomb, it's the same idea that where you can't really protect it as easily and everything's just very, very cheap and not too costly to sort of implement. Like,
Well, what I'm going to say here is people are still contesting if there was a first revolution in military affairs, right? And if we go back to this question around smaller swarming forces or big ticket items, you can go back to 1903 French military doctrine and the Génicot, right? And so this has been debated for a very long time. And it's come out that, you know, at least until today, the big ticket expensive items, especially as your aircraft carrier, your nuclear powered aircraft carrier has the ability to have a high intensity laser weapon on board that can fry mass amounts of drones out of the sky. It might be a better item for you if you're a high tech navy deploying force around the world into the future. If you're a defensive force, maybe like an Iran that wants to send mass amounts of small UMVs, drone boats at established navy, then that might work. Look what's happening in Ukraine, you know, the Sea Baby, the drow boats. These are motorboats, commercially available motorboats. These are jet skis that you'll see out on Cayuga that have been turned into, you know, improvised explosive devices for the sea. And they've rendered the Black Sea relatively useless, Black Sea Fleet. So yeah, I think, again, for a smaller force that maybe doesn't have a navy, then the drone systems are going to be the future, right? And Ukraine doesn't, because a lot of it had to be scuttled or was captured during 2014. Yeah. All right. Now let's talk about a different type of drone system. These are more of the fixed wing drones. Now, these started to come onto the global stage in 2019, specifically September 14th, 2019, when 18 drones, at least three low-flying missiles, hit the Aramco sites in Saudi Arabia in 2 separate localities. So this knocked out of whack 6% of the world's oil production, sent prices jumping by around $11 a barrel to $65 US. And the interesting thing about all of this was that the fingers were directly pointed at Iran, and depending on the investigation you believe afterwards, perhaps rightly so. But the Houthis certainly claimed the attacks immediately, the Houthis being a rebel group out of Yemen that work closely with Iran and see Saudi Arabia most definitely as an enemy, and have been fighting a war on and off with them since 2014 or 2011, depending again where you look. Now, nobody believed that the Houthis, any terrorist group, had the ability to send a drone over 1,000 kilometers and achieve pinpoint precision, a circular error probable of around 1 to 3 meters that was achieved here. That's a state capability. That's something that the US didn't have in its arsenal until around, 1988, the release of Wallstatter and Clay's discriminate deterrence. But what we see here is that they most certainly did have that capability. And very quickly, and at least since that attack, we've seen that the Houthis have harnessed that ability to quite devastating effects. We've seen, and this was an investigation that I led from 2019. So I went out, after those attacks, I was asked to go out to the Middle East to talk to an unnamed Emirati defense minister to talk about some of the things that we've been working on in terms of the history of violent non-state actor drone use. I'd also been working as a weapon advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions, looking at how drones are being used. And so this became a really case in point about how violent non-state actor groups now have this long strategic range, pinpoint precision drone capability. And we know they had them because, well, the Iranians were supplying them to them. Iran, of course, has had a drone program since the 1980s. When you had the Iranian Revolution, Iran wasn't able to maintain those big ticket items that we were talking about with its tanks and its traditional air force, right? Those were contracts that were locked in with Western suppliers and engineers, and you had a few pilots that defected at the same time. But they didn't have time to rest on their laurels. They had to try and fight Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war. And so they start working with Chinese and North Korean technologies, missile technologies, to create shorter and then medium-range missile systems, and then also start producing their own drone capabilities with a really reinforced supply chain and the ability to be able to produce these en masse and very cheap. And so when they wanted to supply their axis of resistance across the broader Middle East, it was these drones that they turned to, drones like the Kasef-1, the Kasef family of systems that have a 200-kilometer range, 100 to 150 mile an hour speed, 30-kilogram warhead, used with an air burst explosive capacity or a proximity fuse, used to try and carry out assassinations and to strike Yemeni bases early on in the war. Now, two things to note here. These drones, as the drone attacks against Israel have been done most recently, are deliberately flown low and they are flown slow, quite literally to fly below the radar, right? Fly under the radar. You reduce your radar signature. They've also been augmented more and more with carbon fiber, which also reduces that radar signature. But when I went to the Middle East, I was taken to a hangar in about 2 hours out of one of the capital cities. And when they opened this hangar in the desert, in front of me was just hundreds of captured Houthi drone systems. And I was able to inspect these for an extended period of time. And what you found, because what the common belief was, a conventional belief then, was that Iran was supplying the drones to the Houthis, and the Houthis were then using these directly with Iranian help against Saudi Arabia or other targets. What we found was that the Houthis, not just being a proxy group, but having their own political ambitions, were immediately recasting these drones in fiberglass. And then, when they could get hold of Iranian military technologies, they would use those to make them fly. But what they also did was just tapped into that commercial drone supply chain and the broader fixed wing aeroplane supply chain of commercially available systems. And that meant that they had the ability to make as many drones as they wanted to, taking that state manufacture, that state design, the same aerodynamics of a state designed drone system, and then making them work by filling them full of these commercial technologies. So you had motors from the Czech Republic, from Germany, from Ireland, winged roads and wiring from China. That's not to say any of these countries were supplying the Houthis directly, but the Houthis are obviously able to tap into a global supply chain of unregulated goods and to make their drones work. When we were doing a report for the UN Office of Counterterrorism that was released in January this year, and we were trying to find that point in the supply chain that you could shut off access to one big ticket item that makes the drones fly, or restrict it, that could maybe stop this proliferation or help reduce the spread of these systems. I guess you could kind of call it like a Second World War ball bearing analysis. You take out the ball bearing sites and you can't produce so many systems. The thing that we could come closest to of that was the lawnmower motors that are used to power these. And you can't put tariffs and restrictions on very easily available to get hold of lawnmower motors. And so our report, which is readily available online, surveyed 32 different, well, surveyed every UN member state that would talk to us, 32 of which had documented problems with drones. And it's based on that data. And it led me to really come to the conclusion that we've reached the uncontrolled proliferation of this age of drone technology, to the point now where the Houthis can, of course, supply their own drone systems to any other violent non-state actor group they want to, and use them for their own political ends, detached from Iranian orders. And we saw that when you had embargoes placed on Iranian supplies, or Iran perhaps wanted to get back on track with the nuclear deal that fell apart from 2015, and the Houthis continued at the same pace their drone strikes because they have all the power when it comes to their drone systems. And so, yeah, as I say, we've reached this age of uncontrolled drone proliferation and violence. And we've only seen these drone systems increase in range and sophistication over the last 5 years. You mentioned attacks on international shipping. Yeah, well, the Houthis are sat very nicely perched off the edge of the Red Sea. And so you link up through the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean from the Indian Ocean. And you can take out some pretty high-value targets. You can blunt humanitarian aid coming through, and you can drive up all of our own prices back home by rendering the Suez Canal not useless, but pretty difficult to transit through, increasing the insurance costs of those shipping routes as well. And we're seeing that those drone strikes are going further and further out into the Indian Ocean. We've seen the drones being used against capital cities and industry, taking out core energy infrastructure, targeting civilian airports, targeting industry deep in the heart of capital cities, especially in Abu Dhabi in the UAE. And then we've seen US bases and diplomatic strikes being targeted across the Middle East by these systems, which of course culminated, as I mentioned, in that deadly attack on Tower 22 by an Iraqi militia with Iranian drone technologies. And so what we're seeing unfolding before us is this increased range, increased precision, payload, in some cases automation, the number of drones being sent. The case of the Mercer Street, which is one of the first commercial tankers to be struck in the Gulf of Oman, was a use of 3 drones to target the bridge of that ship, killing the Romanian captain and the British security guard. And then we're seeing day on day, of course, the attacks on Tel Aviv and deep into central Israel as well.
I just wanted to ask a question related to the use of these weapons for targeted killing. And ask you to talk about the strategic effectiveness, but also the ethical implications of these weapons. I think that the arena of armed conflict, as in Ukraine, Russia, is a whole important subject. But of course, these weapons emerged first around targeted killing. And what has been the actual strategic benefit of these weapons? Audrey Kurth-Cronin writes a lot about these issues, and it's ambiguous. You can certainly achieve the tactical goal. And now, of course, Israel is using it through major arms airstrikes. You knock out the leadership. But does it really end ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and today Hezbollah and Hamas? So that's, I think, an important question in terms of also the impact of these kinds of strikes at leadership and the impact on the possibility of negotiation. And even in a way that's not only destroying the leader of these groups, but destroying the option of negotiation. So
I think you've answered the question. That would be my answer, is that you perpetuate the war, right? And that's how you lead to these forever wars through the targeted killings. You might take out some charismatic figures, but when you splinter that organization, of course, you do have more leaders that pop up or go underground. But then saying that, there is another case. You look through the Obama papers, and Nellie LaHood has written on this with her new book. You see here, and you go through the Obama's drone strikes were so effective against Al-Qaeda, at least that's what Osama bin Laden was written about, that it drove all of his foot soldiers and his regional leaders underground to the point they were completely unoperational. And that frustrated him so much as he was hiding himself from these systems, of course. So, it's one of those that's undecided yet, but a number of nation states, I would say, think that it was most certainly effective, because what I'll come to in the final slide is how these drone systems, as they're proliferating to state actors, and today we're focusing on non-state actors, but on state actors, one of the biggest things that worries me right now is as Turkish drones are being sold to anyone who wants to buy them. Chinese drones are being sold to anyone who wants to buy them. Iranian drones are being supplied to key Iranian allies. What you're seeing is those nation states using them against groups within those nations that are seen as not being cohesive to national stability and cohesion, right? What I mean by that is you're seeing religious groups, ethnic groups being targeted with this pinpoint precision in the communities in which they live, because ethnic diasporas, religious diasporas live together in smaller groups in regions far away perhaps from the metropole. And you're seeing these drones being used to be sent over hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers to target religious festivals, markets, weddings, of course, things that the US did, they state by accident in the past through signature strikes, but these are being deliberately done, killing civilians on their hundreds in Nigeria, in the DRC, in Myanmar, in Burkina Faso. These are some of the things that worry me at the moment, is the use of pinpoint precision, because all precision means is guaranteed destruction, the use of precision to conduct mass killings.
And it weakens any hope of ethical constraints on the use of force in a lot of these kind of things.
If we believe there was any ethical constraint on the use of force. I mean, Obama wasn't playing pretend when he was using just war speak, international law speak, to justify this use of drone strikes. They are a product of the international laws and the restrictions on the use of force that we have in place. But like I said, they can be used in that way, or they can be weapons of deadly pinpoint guaranteed destruction. Yeah, no, thank you. And then I just want to bring us through, as we come to an end here, to some of the kinetic threats. We've mentioned about swarming tactics. I worry that as drones become more autonomous systems in the early stages of autonomy, what you see is a really rudimentary ability to automated frequency hop, so that you are it's easier to evade defense systems. But also as a next stage to that, when you see that the Iron Dome, for example, when it's against rudimentary linear projectiles coming in of mortars and rockets, you see that the Iron Dome still lets in between 10 and 20% of all things that are fired at it. it's having a real drone problem at the moment. It isn't able to counter the drones even as well as it's able to counter mortars and rockets. And that's the most sophisticated, expensive air defense system in the world. And those counter systems, those smart counter systems that can lock onto a target are not cheap. And then when you have drone technologies that may be able to evade those smarter air defense systems, and it's just going to get even harder to have high-tech air defense. And so I guess that also leads me to worries about, broader a lack of a loss of control, a loss of air superiority at a strategic level as opposed to just a tactical level as well. Increased range, I'm very worried about drones increasing not only by 1,000 or 2,000 kilometers, but the latest drones we're seeing developed by China have a 10,000 kilometer range. Will you see those pass into the hands of violent non-state actor groups? Will you see an intercontinental range of drone strikes in the future? We see drones being used to spread misinformation, urge defection with 4 and 5G transmitters on board, used for electronic warfare and jamming. We also worry about the use of drones for espionage across sensitive sites, nuclear power sites. We've had hundreds of incursions over the Pentagon. We've had drones crashing into the White House lawn. Are drones able, well, they are, but will they be used more for espionage in this so-called new Cold War that we're entering? And that becomes even more pertinent when we see the cityscapes of the future, revolutions in logistics and transportation. Well, you have thousands of drones, some weighing a few pounds and others a few tons, flying between rural distribution centers and inner city delivery hubs. Drones will become the critical infrastructure for transport and logistics of cities. They won't just threaten vital infrastructure. And so if you can have a situation where those legitimate drones are hacked or are spoofed and that system is infiltrated, and you have a drone attack through that, you're gonna have to bring that whole system down, which then compromises your ability to supply hospitals, to move patients, or to take you home from the pub when you're drunk at the end of the night. But either way, you're starting to see how that future that we're very quickly rushing towards is incredibly vulnerable. And then one final thing I will state here is this autonomy question. Now, lots of debates about whether or not Turkey's Cargo 2 drone is truly as autonomous as they first said it was. They've now rolled back and said it's not. But the UN report in 2021 stated that in Libya, these tactical Cargo 2 drones used by Turkey fired on retreating troops of the Libyan National Army led by Field Marshal Haftar, shooting them in the back and killing them based on a preset algorithm which has a preset load of targets, which gives pre-authority for this drone to strike without a human being in that loop of control. And since then, we have allegations of Israel using similar targeting systems, of Ukraine doing the same with their Saka Scout, which is a retrofitted agricultural drone, and Russia doing the same with some of their drone systems as well. So are we quickly rushing towards humans being outside of the loop of control and delegating that decision over whether or not a human lives or dies to a flawed algorithm? And you'll see some reports coming out in the Telegraph and the Wall Street Journal in a couple of weeks that I've been helping to work on how groups of hobbyists have been using ChatGPT, Copilot, Grok to write up codes to build autonomous drones using off-the-shelf equipment and using the Raspberry Pis as processors. I mean, as you can imagine, I can drone on. That's the only time I can. These are all the things that worry me to the point where I've written too much on it. But yeah, if we have any other questions, then please, I'm happy to keep on talking about it.